Hi, welcome to the use and assembly guide for the panel jig. Note that the oak cleats mounted to the wall on the back are longer than the width of the setup currently, and that's to allow for future add-ons for additional cleats if desired. In terms of use, I will walk through the process as a whole. Here we're looking at cutting the S2S lumber to length. So for this portion of the process, I cut boards roughly 5 inches longer than the final length of the tabletop. The next step is to use a track saw to rip an edge on each board. This will give a reference edge when running through the table saw in the next step. Note that the joiner that I use has an 8-inch wide cutter head, so boards roughly 8 inches or less simply have one edge straight lined using the track saw. If you have a board that is wider than 8 inches or whatever the width of your cutter head is on your joiner, rip the board roughly in the middle. Note that having an 8-inch wide cutter head creates a healthy bottleneck in that you're minimizing the potential for cupping and other forms of warp after assembly years down the line. Next, we're going to rip a parallel edge using the table saw as seen here. You're trying to remove as little material as possible simply to create two parallel edges. It's now time to mark both faces of all boards with a pencil. This is an indicator of material removed. For 8/4 material, I generally face joint first for a flat face. However, with thinner material, it has more flex to it, so I generally run it directly through the planer. These 8/4 boards were flat enough where I felt comfortable going directly to the planer. Again, for 8/4 material, I will generally face joint one face. In this case, they were flat, so I went directly to the planer. Remove roughly the same amount of material if possible from each face to minimize potential warping. Given that the track saw and the table saw created pretty straight edges, it's now time to fine-tune them by edge joining as seen here. Now that boards have been milled properly, it's time to mark the locations for your biscuits or your dominoes. So I place a line roughly 3/4 to 1 inch in from each edge. This will be removed when the top is cut to size later on. And from there, every 10 to 12 inches or so, I create another layout line. At this point, you should also mark the order of the boards. So working your way away from your body, mark 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Also place an arrow pointing up so you know the final orientation of assembly. Using a biscuit joiner or domino joiner with the wide setting, cut mortises for each and every layout line. Using silicone-free wax and a putty knife, place small amounts of the wax every foot or so. This will be buffed in with a white Scotch-Brite pad and a random orbital sander. The wax prevents glue squeeze out from getting into the grains of the wood, which not only makes sanding later on much more tedious and time consuming, but also will often create problems when you go to apply a finish. Buff the wax into the wood using a Scotch-Brite pad cut to size and attached to the sander. Make sure to do your best to avoid getting wax on the edges where the joints will actually be, as the wax will prevent the glue from adhering into the opposing wood. Now it's time for assembly. Clamp boards together in corresponding order as seen here. If you need to reorient the layout of the boards where taller boards are next to each other and shorter boards are next to each other for ease of application, go ahead and do that. The clamps prevent glue from spilling in between each board and creating a mess. Using a disposable brush that I generally just keep in a plastic container filled with water, spread the glue around as seen here. Insert each domino into the mortises as quickly as you can to prevent glue from skinning over. Now it's time to actually install the boards in the panel jig. So with the numbers facing the wall, so the top of the tabletop or panel facing the wall, slide each board in sequentially starting with 1 and place each board on top of the previous. Use a dead blow hammer if you need to tap things into place. Make sure that the bottom board is sitting on top of the nuts, so when we go to actually tighten the cauls, the panel will be tight to the cauls themselves and not jammed against the nuts. So here I'm just snugging up the bottom nuts, and I'm using a roughly a 4 to 6 torque setting on the drill, kind of depending on the drill you have. You're just trying to snug it up, don't need to over tighten it, and this just makes sure that the bottom board will stay on top of the nuts and to hold things tight while you assemble. After all boards are placed inside of the jig, tighten each of the top nuts, again using the same setting, and we're trying to keep the cauls tight to the panel to create a flat panel without over tightening where we end up deflecting the outside caul and creating a gap somewhere in the middle of the board. After all the cauls have been snugged, take each pipe clamp and install it in the center of each bay, and as you can see, the ends where I've centered the panel roughly equivalent on each end, and that way I can get a clamp on each end. So place them in first, snug them up a little bit, and then I go back with pretty aggressive pressure. I'm not white knuckling it, but it is close. Red oak, or oak in general, requires a little bit more pressure, so I go ahead and lean into these. So after you've placed them, snug them, go ahead and go back and really tighten them down. And after that, you're all done. The final step is to just wait overnight at bare minimum, remove the clamps, back the nuts off. I use a rolling work table and I roll it up directly against the wall, lock the wheels, and I can just slide the panel right out and let it drop onto the work table, and then I roll the work table back to the main work area. Assembly and install of the jig itself is pretty straightforward. I use oak for the mounting cleats. So again, notice that the oak cleats are a little bit longer than the current layout, and that's just in case I would like to add more cleats in the future. So mill your cleats and mount them plumb, level, etc. as seen here. If you need to shim the cleats to make sure that you're creating a flat surface, this is very important. If you need to shim behind the cleats, do that. I got lucky, this drywall was pretty straight. Again, if you need to shim, go ahead and do that now. Use cabinet screws to mount the cleats directly to the studs. After you've mounted the cleats and the legs to the wall, create layout lines. I use 12-inch centers for each of the bays here. And after you do that, degrease each caul using automotive degreaser or another solvent. After that dries, go ahead and install each bolt with a washer just under the head on each of the inside cauls. Then run the inside nut tight to the caul. I use a little bit of Loctite here. Use a wrench and an impact driver with a socket to snug that up. Then install the inside cauls on your layout lines directly to the cleats. After you do that, apply packing tape on the faces of both the inside mounted cauls as well as the outside cauls. Then slide the outside cauls onto the bolts, stick a washer, and then slide the nut on, and you're good to go.